chat. Thanks, Patsy.
Hey Sheri, how's the consulting? How's your consulting machine going?
It's okay. Got a few projects that I'm working on right now.
Cool. Whenever you get a chance, we got to sit down. I got to show you some tools I built. I got to get your feedback.
Yep.
You've built tools?
Oh yeah. So look, ChatGPT has done wonders for me. And as my coding assistant, it saved me from having to do things that would have required me to have entire teams to do. I could just do myself. Sheri's actually seen one of them, the tool that I built for accessibility maturity measurement, which is built off of the W3C model, in which he participated and helped guide, that portion of the organization to build. That was the first one that I built, really kind of using ChatGPT as my coding assistant. I built like 3 more things. I'm working on something for an accessibility bug reporting, and I'm trying to update that right now to incorporate some of a few portions of automated testing.
Oh, wow. And hi, CJ. I didn't get a chance to say hello to you earlier. Like, hello. All right. And Claire. Hi, Claire. How are you? You should let her get situated before I jump on her. All right. Well, we should get going, I think. So I want to say I'm the co-host of the Ethics Guild, along with Joy Purdy, who last event she had her car engine blow up. So so I hope the same thing doesn't happen and she makes it to the meeting. We host the Ethics Guild in the AI Salon, and I think most of us here are members of the AI Salon, but I will put the link in for Sheri and Keith also. And I just want to introduce Sheri Byrne-Haber. Is that right? Yes. And,
that is correct.
And Dr. Keith Newton, who will be chatting with us about AI and accessibility. So take it away, guys.
Cool. Well, very much. First of all, thank you for having me and having Sheri here. These are exciting times to be talking both about artificial intelligence and about accessibility. As we're kind of talking at the very beginning, one of the most exciting things that has been for me is that the artificial intelligence kind of boom post-ChatGPT has really enabled me to build a whole bunch of my own tools now that I use for accessibility, in cooperation with artificial intelligence. Now, that won't be the entire subject of what we get into tonight. Tonight, we're going to really be talking about accessibility from a couple of different aspects. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can actually see the presentation. Does everybody see artificial intelligence and digital accessibility? Awesome. So, I'm going to start off here, and at some point, I'm going to kick it over to Sheri, who is just going to be ridiculously excellent. I won't spoil you with how excellent she is coming up, but just know, I've lost several roles to her, and I'm proud of it. So, I'm happy to have her as a colleague and as a friend, and to be constantly talking about accessibility and artificial intelligence with her. But for today, the stuff that we're going to talk to you about, for me, I'm an accessibility kind of person who's a director, a lead, a trainer, but also really been deep into prompt engineering and architecture for AI and ML, all this other stuff. I also, outside of that, I'm into leadership and fitness, and also the board will be assimilated. This presentation, for my portion, I'm going to guide you through some high-level philosophies and some best practices that can be applied to incorporation of artificial intelligence for persons with disabilities. Now, I'm going to also purposely stay non-technical. They'll hear references to guides and tools, but overall, we're going to focus on practices and experiences. And it is my expectation that all of you who are joining us here this evening will be an active participant in all activities. All right. So with that, the structure of the things I'm going to walk you through is I'm going to take you through an activity. Then I'm going to go through a particular the topic, and then I'm going to take you through another activity. Okay. Any questions on that before we get started? All right, awesome. So first things first, activity number 1 is your cell phone. Now, I know during these meetings, most of these meetings, people tell you not to pull out your cell phones, but does everybody have a cell phone with you? If you do, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, go ahead and pull out your cell phone. Okay, and make sure that that cell phone is on, right? So pull it out, make sure you got it handy, you got it on. Okay, now take that phone, place it in front of you. Okay, everybody's phone is on. Everybody's ready? Okay, good. Now, I want you to close your eyes. Now, without opening your eyes, I'd like to use your phone and go to aisalon.com. Go ahead, I'll wait. Anybody there yet? Okay, now usually at this point, somebody will say something like, okay, Siri, open up AI Salon. Right? And that'll be the guideline that'll kind of like walk you through. But okay, so nobody's gotten yet to, oh, Patsy, that's what you did? Awesome. Awesome. Patsy, come off mic and tell us.
So it just got to the point of, here, right? Because it didn't actually like go all the way through the prompt, so to speak. When I had an Android, that was better if I went ahead and used the word website. It would have performed better, but I didn't go ahead and like carry the prompt all the way through.
Awesome. Thank you, Patsy. Did anybody else try something like that? No? Let me ask you some targeted. Sheri, go ahead. No? Okay. All right. Well,
No.
Sorry, I heard you.
Oh, so let me go off mic then. Sorry, I tried typing aisalon.com, but it redirected me to a domain purchase site. So.
No.
Okay, but at least you got on. So let's ask you guys kind of like, go ahead and post this in the chat. What were your experiences? What kind of things did you kind of learn from this? What was your challenge? And then how could your experience have been improved? Like what kind of things were happening to you? Did you go to like okay, you had, okay, I see Charles, raise your hand. Charles, go ahead and come off mic and tell us. I'm sorry, or Claire. Sorry, Claire, go ahead. I don't know that I'm seeing everybody, so whoever said raise your hand, go ahead and come off mic and say.
Sorry, I actually raised my hand on accident, but the only thing that I think would have made it easier would be if I had Neuralink or something like that, and I could have just like thought like the salon.
Okay.
The AI salon, not the hair salon, and maybe would have gotten there faster.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Anybody else? What was your experience? What did you find most challenging about this?
I didn't know where to start. I didn't know what to do. I was just lost.
Uh-huh. Everybody, how many people have actually tried to navigate on the internet not using your eyes? Yeah, it's a different experience, but there are millions of people who actually do this every day. So one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we did is that we have an experience in which, you suddenly are forced into, hey, wait a minute, I need to get to some information. How is it that I'm going to get to this information if there's not a mechanism that's there to be able to help me do it? And that's the same thing that a lot of people who are navigating the internet every day face. People who are physically, who are either challenged visually or challenged via motion, will need some kind of assisting kind of tool. We call it assistive technology. We need technology written in a way that encompasses the kinds of things that we're doing. Let's try it one other way. Close your eyes. Try to go to chatgpt.com. Anybody there
Can
yet?
we use the app if we have it installed?
You can do whatever you want. Try to go to chatgpt.com, but your eyes must be closed. Okay, let's stop there for a second. What was your experience? Claire says you can't do it without looking. CJ raised a hand. CJ?
Hi, my name is CJ. I'm an African-American male wearing a blue shirt and a white hat. I found out I could open it, but I had no idea that it was launched. there was no sort of response of saying, hey, it is open, it is running. I managed to say, hey, Google, open this, and it worked. But again, I did not know that it was running, though.
Awesome. So how could that experience have been improved, CJ, since we got you on the mic?
I would have loved to have heard like program open or chat is running or any sort of acknowledgement that what I asked it to do had been completed.
Excellent. I appreciate you sharing. Thank you so much. Okay, so everybody give yourself a nice little round of applause. You did a great job in terms of now not just learning a little bit about accessibility as an abstract, but really experiencing it from a first person kind of perspective. So with that, we're going to get into this, and I'm just going to say very quickly, you've learned from this, it's not about the technology, it's about the application of the technology and the way that things are built. And all of these technologies that we have to be adapted to meet the needs of persons with disabilities. Now I'm going to give you kind of a really high-level overview of AI and accessibility, but first to give you a good idea of just a high-level idea of what accessibility is. Okay, first of all, is there anybody here by show of hands is already familiar with accessibility? Okay, a couple of people, a couple of folks, and a couple of folks not. All right, so for those of you who are familiar, this is going to sound, well, familiar. For those of you who aren't, it's going to stay very high level. When we're talking about accessibility, we're not talking about it in the casual sense that everybody talks about ChatGPT and these tools now being accessible, meaning being available. We're talking about a specific term, meaning that we're ensuring that websites, applications, digital content are usable for people with disabilities. And we include those who have visual disabilities, auditory disabilities, motor, and cognitive impairments. So it could be somebody who's blind, somebody who's deaf, somebody who has a motor impairment, somebody who has a cognitive impairment, such as a traumatic brain injury, any combination thereof. And I also forgot to mention any kind of like speech disability, but that's kind of the primer in terms of the area. Now, there are laws and guidelines in the US. There's the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 508. Globally, there are lots of different laws. And so there are laws, and then there are guidelines, such as what's called WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that mandate that content have to be designated and developed to be accessible to all users. And in doing so, that ensures equitable access and not being discriminatory. And in fact, having software that is not available to somebody who's disabled in any of the ways that I mentioned is exactly the same level of discrimination as discriminating against somebody for color, national origin, sexual orientation, and the like. Okay, so what does this mean kind of in a nutshell at a very high level? Every user interface has features and content that are operable using assistive technologies. These are things like screen readers. Raise your hand if you've heard about a screen reader. Okay, great. Anybody who, anything like a Zoom and all of those different pieces. It also means that, if you're developing software, that you're also conducting regular accessibility testing and your regular audits to check for what's wrong, and testing to make sure that whatever you're developing before you launch it is going to be compliant with all of the things that we discussed. And also at a high level, including persons with disabilities as part of the user base for all products. And what I mean by that is from concept to completion, you're thinking about what is it that somebody who is not like me or completely able in some way, and I'm using it kind of that, it's awkward language, but I'm using it in this way to say like somebody who doesn't have all of the facilities that we expect from everybody else, how is it that they're going to navigate? How will somebody blind navigate? How will somebody deaf? How will somebody who's only navigating using a keyboard operate an interface? And that's kind of it in a high level. In practice, that also means that you've got what's called semantic content, which means behind the scenes, everything has an appropriate label and is structured and consistently implemented to work with assistive technologies. That any change to the interface, users are notified about that, kind of sort of like the thing that CJ was talking about, saying, boy, it sure would have been great if I was notified that that app was open. That's also a requirement of digital accessibility. And then making sure, as I've already mentioned, like interfaces are operable using assistive technologies, such as those screen readers, keyboard only operations, Zoom, Reflow, pieces like that. Okay, so the problem thus far is that a lot of companies at this point don't often implement these inclusive practices, and accessibility considerations are not getting incorporated into the design and development process from the beginning. And by the way, this is not just artificial intelligence. This is all software across the board, but it's getting magnified through artificial intelligence, because the result is that when we've got these innovative tools that are getting launched every 30 seconds, people with disabilities are getting excluded from their use. You know, the last 2 weeks, for example, in artificial intelligence have had a bevy of releases and re-releases in video generating technology, right? From runway ML, all the way from, you know, more posts about Sora, to which we still don't have access, to at least, you know, 5 more models from China coming through. And again, every single one of them, you know, have challenges for people who have disabilities, and they're excluded from this. In the US, this actually reflects in a loss of revenue opportunity. And the short idea is this: there's 20% of the population who's disabled, or roughly about 20 to 25% of the population who's disabled. In the US, that averages between $500 and $750 billion in disposable income that is going untapped by industry. So they're losing out on a gigantic piece of revenue and an opportunity to grow simply by not making these adaptations. Other things include negative brand reputation. So we've heard, if you ever get a chance to look up Robles versus Domino's, it's a fun case, and you can see how a pizza company could have spent $100,000 to fix a problem instead of the millions that they continue to spend trying to combat the problem. And then, of course, legal risk, which we talked about a little bit before. But there's a gigantic opportunity here, right? Because of the opportunities that AI presents, you can have enhanced user experiences. And this goes beyond the whole idea of personalization for all of these different interfaces. You can utilize AI to create more intuitive and standardized interfaces, using AI to get data-driven insights to analyze user behavior and feedback, and gaining insights from persons with disabilities and about their interactions, and identifying areas for improvement. Now, a little star here, there's a little caveat here in terms of privacy and health data, but that's a side discussion in terms of what that means. The opportunity to still get data-driven insights is tremendous and should be explored. And the biggest one for these creators of all these tools, whether it's Chat GPT, whether it's Claude, you know, whether it's Runway, is to be able to stand out in the market with scalable solutions, which, to the point, can represent, can serve potentially 20% greater audience and gain that competitive market share. So that's kind of the first gigantic piece of this. All right, any questions on any of that so far? Okay, well then with that, let's move on to our next activity. This activity is going to be called Show GPT. Now to do this, I'm going to need to open up Chat GPT here in another window. So open and let me get that running. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. Oops, wait a minute. Unless, of course, I went on the wrong screen. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. If you want to, you can also open this in your own browser behind the scenes, but I'm going to walk you through and show. I'm going to open ChatGPT, and then I'm also going to open a screen reader. Then together, we're going to prompt GPT for content, and then we're going to close our eyes and we're going to review those results. But we're going to use a screen reader in actual practice to do this. And again, my goal here is not to get you with all of the technical information about this, but I want you to kind of see the experience from somebody who's going to be using this type of tool. Okay, so let me go ahead and stop the share for just a moment. Stop that share. And I am going to reshare, this time with ChatGPT inside of a window. So getting ChatGPT, escaping from the other presentation, reopening ChatGPT because I accidentally closed it, saying all these things out loud because I'm old, and that's what old people do. Okay, we are going to share the screen. We're going to go ahead and share ChatGPT. We're also going to share the tab audio. Make sure that that is on. And actually, let me do entire screen. Screen one. Nope, got to do the tab. Forgot this is what Google does. All right. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and fire up NVDA. Now, NVDA is a screen reader that is open and available and free that you can download on the PC. And the first thing I'm going to ask you in a minute is to see if you can hear the screen reader.
NVDA update dialog, NVDA version 20, NVDA update. Welcome to NVDA dialog. Welcome.
Okay,
Meet Octane MBX.
Is everybody able to hear the screen reader? Okay, awesome. All right, so now here's our challenge. I'm going to navigate via keyboard to get to the message chat GPT prompt. So, because we're going to want to get their creative prompt. So the first thing I'm going to want you, while we're doing that, I want you to think of something for which we can prompt. So let me first, to navigate via keyboard, the first thing that you should do is you use one finger. No, not the other finger you're thinking about. One finger, index finger. Do tab key. So I'm going to hit tab.
Clickable. This call is being recorded. Button collapsed. Sheri Byrne. This call is being transcribed. Button collapsed. The presentation is being annotated. Button collapsed.
And I'm on the wrong screen. Stand by.
Chat GPT document. Toolbar. Address and search bar. Edit has autocomplete control plus selected.
Okay.
Chat GPT document.
Okay, so now you see, now we're on chat GPT. So let me get
Clickable chat history navigation landmark button.
So now you'll see something that says close sidebar. You heard navigation button. This is where we're currently located on the left side. If I hit tab again.
Clickable button.
Now you hear that I'm on some kind of button. Now visually, you can see this button. What do you think this button may be? Anybody have any idea? Put it in the chat or come off mic and say.
What do we know it to be, or what do we think from the voice prompt?
Somebody said new chat. Somebody said no idea. It's actually the new chat button. But notice when you get to it,
Clickable button. Clickable button.
all you hear is clickable button. So close your eyes for a second and imagine that you're navigating and you're trying to get to the to put a prompt, and you hit tab.
Clickable button.
Okay, button. I have no idea what it is.
Clickable button.
Clickable button. Do you know what that button is without opening your eyes? No, that's our challenge, right? And again, this is something that's really simple to fix. So I'm gonna show you just how simple it is to fix. I'm gonna go inside this code right now, and we're gonna do a little bit of a hack. So if anybody has never seen this, this is gonna be fun.
Menu selected submenu. Inspect N14 of 14. Chat alert dev tools is docked to bottom.
Okay, now inside the dev tools, I can actually hack. Oh, you can't see the dev tool portion. Are you seeing? Oh, wait, are you seeing the dev tool portion? No, you're not? Okay, let's see what we can do here to do that. I might have to stop sharing. Bear with me a second.
Octane MBX. Desktop Windows ML. Present now button. Choose what to share with meet.google.com.
I turned off my
Entire screen
primary
tap control.
for that, so you wouldn't hear like multiples upon multiples of screen readers.
Not a problem.
Don't show this again. Menu button.
Do you see the chat window now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first turn off the screen.
Exit NVDA dialog.
So that it's not continuing to chatter. Then I'm going to go in here and I'm going to change that button, this button, which was unlabeled, to something that's got a label. So we've got this button class. This is what it is. I'm going to actually hack the HTML code, edit as HTML, and I'm going to put in an ARIA label. And I'm just going to call this button something distinctive because I want to make sure that we know what it is. So let's call this, what's something that you absolutely hate eating, but somebody loves to cook for you?
Oh,
Put that in the chat. Something that you hate eating, but somebody loves to cook for you. Any thoughts? Okay, mashed potatoes. Okay, so I'm gonna put mashed potato hot dogs. Okay, all right. I'm gonna call this mashed hot potato dogs. And as soon as I actually get back into the code, I can do that. Silly me. Mashed hot potato. Let's just spell it with an E just for the heck of it. Dogs. Okay. So now we've hacked that. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen reader back on.
Welcome to NVDA dialog. Welcome. Well, okay button. Chat GPT. DevTools document. Elements pet.
Now, is everybody still hearing the screen reader? Yes? Okay, great. So let me get in here.
Chat. Clickable button. Clickable mashed hot potato dogs button. Clickable button.
That was great.
Clickable mashed hot potato dogs button.
Yeah.
That's,
And again, like what happens suddenly, right? Now you know exactly what the button is, right? The button is mashed hot dog. I mean, if you give it a proper label, the proper label for this would have been a new chat. But since we know that we could actually put it in there, and you're right, Lori. Yeah, we shouldn't have to do that. But
So-
why can't OpenAI do that? That's a really good question, because the short answer is they can do that, but they've chosen not to. And that's the problem. Patsy, you have a question.
yes. Will this button label persist until you clear your cache? Or does it, when you close the window, does it go away and you have to put it back in again?
That's
Okay.
correct. If I close this window, this is a hack to show you what's possible.
Right.
What should happen is that label should always persist. And the irony is that it's not difficult for that label to always persist. It's something that is literally a 20-year-old code solution. Yeah, interesting thing. Okay, so first of all, thank you again, everybody, for participating in that. Give yourself a nice little round of applause. I'm going to
Flex desktop Windows M.
stop the screen.
Exit NVDA dial.
Let me stop that for a second, and then we're going to go back into the presentation and do a couple more things before I kick this over to Sheri. So, all right, we've been through that. Whoops. Oh, back. Okay. So the lesson from this, we saw the experiences, we saw the challenges, and we saw the opportunities. Like, hey, we just missed an opportunity to label this thing in a way that will allow somebody who's visually impaired to actually get what's going on. And additionally, somebody who's cognitively impaired who might be using a screen reader, because those folks use it too, who use it for support to understand the context, miss opportunity for context. And it's not something that's difficult for them to do. Okay, so all of this technology should be adapted to meet the needs of persons with disabilities. Here's the thing, the adaptation is available now, as we've seen, using current technology and not making it accessible. Darn it. Not making AI accessible equals missed opportunities. Okay, my final thought before I kick this over to Sheri. And Sheri, coming to you here in about 3 slides. If you're making any kind of artificial intelligence or any kind of software as a whole, there are only really 3 things that you really got to think about. One is thinking inclusively in concept and design. What does that mean? It means that you're considering use cases beyond your own ability. You're including the perspectives of people besides your own if you're not already part of a community that's blind or deaf or motor impaired or cognitively impaired. And you're asking yourself the critical questions and using those answers to influence the development. So like if a user can't see the screen, how do I make sure that that user is accomplishing their goal? And I realize I've been leaning very heavily on visually impaired. It's not the only impairment, but it's easiest for me to convey the idea to somebody else to start to get thinking. Okay, so we started thinking about conceiving and designing software and applications. When you're talking about building those apps, then you're both developing inclusively and you're testing inclusively. You're testing all of these applications using assistive technologies the same way that we did, for example, with ChatGPT, and using those results to adjust how that tech is operated and deployed. You're including accessibility experts early in the evaluation of your components and frameworks so that you're making sure that you've kept from concept to completion people who can guide you along the way to make sure that you've met that obligation. And again, asking those critical questions and using those to influence the development. And we talked about this, again, with visually impaired users. One final thing, in terms of testing, You're testing against a standard. You're testing all those applications using assistive technologies and releasing your product only after it's passed such that testing. You're including accessibility experts in the evaluation of that software. For example, performing an audit against the WCAG 2.1 or 2.2 standards. And then each time that content is updated, you're ensuring that no issues are occurring by conducting regular testing and regression testing to make sure that no new accessibility issues have been introduced. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Any questions on that before I kick this over to Sheri? Awesome. Guys, you've been great. You've been great participants, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Sheri has to deliver now. And just a little bit of an introduction. She's absolutely fantastic. If you get a chance to go onto her website or sign up for her email, she publishes a ridiculous amount of accessibility articles, and they're all very, very good. She's helped build accessibility program not only at McDonald's, but also VMware, and is just always up to date on all of the not only the technical aspects, but also the business practices of organizations and helping guide them in their areas. So let me kick it over to my friend and colleague, Sheri.
Well, thank you, Dr. Keith. That's really kind of you to say.
I didn't tell them about the archery because I knew you weren't going to shoot.
You did not tell them about the archery. You can tell them about the archery while I'm getting the deck loaded.
Okay, so one of the other fun things about Sheri is that she is a world-class archer, and one of the reasons I know that is because I never want to get shot by Sheri. But to her defense, she also says she is a very kind she's a purely vegetarian archer. She'll only shoot paper and apples, and if you can imagine her in Robin Hood, kind of.
Okay, I'm not sure if I screwed this up or not, so let's give it a try and see what happens. So I've got this deck that I'm willing to share. About the first half of it gets into that's an introductory level of the technical weeds behind how artificial intelligences are trained, how LLMs are built, how you sort data and categorize it and things like that. We're not going to talk about that today. What we're going to talk about is very specific to accessibility applications in AI and what I've tried and what works and kind of what's not ready for prime time yet. So I am going to jump to slide 10. So we talk about ChatGPT. It's almost starting to become the Kleenex of AI. And what I mean by that is people say ChatGPT when they mean generative AI, just like people say Kleenex when they mean, tissue. So it says I've got a mirror going, but I think if I start presenting from here, I should be okay. Oh, tell me if things start to go wrong. Okay, so ChatGPT.
Sheri, just to let you know, we're seeing your we're seeing your PowerPoint show. We're not actually seeing your maximized presentation. If you're hoping to show the maximized presentation, otherwise we're seeing your notes and everything, and that's fine.
All right, there's only one order that this works in, and I don't use Google Meets enough to have it committed to memory. So I think I have to go into slideshow mode first. And then I have to tab back to Google.
We just wanted to challenge you, Sheri.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay, now I'm going to try to share from here and hopefully it will be fine. Otherwise, there's a small enough number of people in this group, I can send out the deck. So if I do window and then I do that, and then I do that. So I must be old because Keith said only old people talk themselves through these tech things. That's what I've got. So sorry about that. Let me, if I do slideshow again, are you getting the full slide deck now?
No, but I think that's okay.
All right. Okay. So, one of the things that generative AIs that are trained in accessibility language are good at is creating test plans. Okay, so they're good. It's define, search, predict. Right? You define what you want. It searches around through the data that it has built through its neural networks, and then it predicts output that you're going to be interested in. So you can ask most generative AIs simple questions about accessibility, like how do you make a product that contains a shopping cart accessible? And it will actually produce a multi-step test plan or development plan that says, okay, these are the 10 things that you have to do to make a shopping cart accessible. So, up until about a year ago, people had to memorize all that stuff, or they had to have done it before and had, taken notes that they could adapt to future things. So I find that ChatGPT or generative AI is really good. So it'll say, look, you have to do the keyboard navigation. You have to make it screen reader compatible, using proper HTML tags, using ARIA. So that's what Keith just demoed to you. You have to make labels. You have to provide feedback when actions take place. You have to make it magnify. You have to do certain things with your error messages. So that's one thing that I always advise people on is, you can't take AI output verbatim because AI still hallucinates, not as much as it used to, but it still can give you bad input. But you can take this information and use it as a starting point to kick off other documents. So test it with real users. So somebody else mentioned that in the chat earlier. So it will give you an objective. If you put into a generative AI, maybe you still have ChatGPT open from Keith's example, and you can do this yourself. Write a test plan to see if modal dialog box is accessible. It will give you everything. It'll give you an objective, it'll give you a scope, it'll tell you what tools you need, and it will give you numbered test cases and steps for the 7 most important things having to do with modal dialog boxes. So, accessibility always has 10 pounds of flour in a 5-pound sack, right? There's always more to do than you have time or budget to do. So by being able to speed some of these things up by using generative AI, you can then dedicate the time and budget that you have to things that don't require generative AI input anymore, like running research sessions for using people with disabilities, or like testing some of the more lesser used assistive technology, like sip and puff devices, for example, which are used by people with quadriplegia. So like I said, any generative AI that's been trained on the WCAG data can do some of this stuff for you that it used to take. If you asked somebody a year ago, let's say a couple of years of accessibility testing experience to write a full shopping cart test plan from scratch, probably would take them 8 hours. If you asked me to do it, it would take me 2, but that's because I've done it a bunch of times before. With this, you can take the output from ChatGPT and have a perfect accessibility test plan for shopping cart, probably in 20 or 30 minutes if you know what you're doing. All right, moving on. Another thing that ChatGPT is really good at is translating languages. So we know about things like translating English into Russian or French into Italian, but people don't think about plain language in English as being a second language, but it really is, because what it does is it takes information that might require a higher level of education to understand, and it reconstructs that language. Maybe you lose some of the nuances, maybe you lose a few of the details, but you put it at a level that more people can understand. And so the example I always use is the first paragraph of Moby Dick. And I use that because I used to be an intellectual property attorney, and Moby Dick is out of copyright. So I can't get busted by anybody. John Grisham isn't going to sue me because I used the first paragraph of the Lincoln Lawyer or something like that instead of this. So, we're a little pressed for time, and I want people to be able to answer questions or ask questions. So I'm not going to read this all out loud, but you can see Moby Dick can be really cumbersome to understand because it's written in older English. It was written in, I don't know, kind of like the 1850s kind of time frame. And it would be very difficult for an English language learner or somebody with an intellectual or developmental delay to understand. But you could make Moby Dick accessible by doing a plain language translation. And almost all generative AIs have the rules of plain language built into them. It's not particularly nuanced. It's not particularly complicated. It's just rules to be followed, which is the best kind of AI there is. 35 years ago, when I first started programming, I actually worked for an AI company, and they were all rule-based engines. They were like decision trees where you would say, okay, check this data, make this decision, and branch. And then you would continue to do that until you got to the answer. It's a lot more sophisticated now. You created a GPT for plain language? Well, it might still be useful. But it doesn't take much to take a agnostic GPT and train it for plain language. There's really only like 15 basic rules that gets you most of the way there. So the next example that I provide people, this was actually a live example. So I don't know if everybody remembers, like maybe 6 months ago, a nationwide cellular emergency alert system went out. And so the message that the US government probably had 30 people sitting in like 50 meetings to come up with the language, tested at a 14th grade level when you ran it through the Flesch-Kincaid readability score. Okay, that means 40% of the US got left behind. 40% of the US does not read at second grade of college level. If you run it through ChatGPT, which I did, it took me 20 seconds, it generated an almost identical version, not nearly as many details lost as with Moby Dick, and it was at an 8th grade reading level, which is much more consumable across the United States. So that's my next, my first example is use it to run test plans for things that you don't necessarily have the time or the energy, that are fairly straightforward and unambiguous. Number 2 is definitely use it for plain language conversions, making sure that your content is targeting the grade level that you expect your audience to be. So what are the drawbacks? Well, we know sometimes ChatGPT hallucinates, or all generative AIs hallucinate. It's happening less, but it's definitely still an issue. Intellectual property issues are definitely a big deal. If you have a company that's less concerned about intellectual property, then you can go ahead and use ChatGPT if that's within the scope of what your company allows. A lot of larger companies do care about intellectual property concerns. They're worried that they're going to get sued for the profits that they made by using infringing material. And so they're building what we're calling private AI, which is AI that's built entirely on public domain information, stuff and images that are not, don't have copyright protections. You have to pay for it to get the good version, which clearly Keith and I both do, because it has said ChatGPT 4.0, and you only get that if you pay. Otherwise, you get the older version, which is 3.5, and you get 8 queries every 3 hours, or at least that's what it was the last time I checked. And when you run out of that, then you either have to wait or you have to pay money. Results can sometimes lose your voice. We lost the voice of Herman Melville, when we did that plain language conversion, because we simplified the language and the voice gets lost. So that's something that you have to pay attention to, especially for brand stuff, because brand always has a voice. There's a cutoff date, so current stuff is just not going to happen. You can't ask ChatGPT, what could a political candidate, pick one, in the debate have done better, because the cutoff is from May of last year. So there's 14 months of data that ChatGPT 4.0, the paid version, doesn't have access to unless you feed it the facts. So you can actually start your statement with, okay, assume these facts, and you can say, you can talk about Taylor Swift if you want to, and what happened to her stage in Dublin yesterday, and you can give it a set of facts that it can then build into the system to predict the result that you're looking at, and then obviously for things like resumes and like homework submissions, there are now ChatGPT detectors. So if you're doing something that really needs to be original, you don't want to do it with ChatGPT because it might get picked up by the detector. All right, so there's one of the things that I've successfully done with ChatGPT that I really love is generating ACR VPAT documentation. So ACRs are accessibility conformance reports, and VPAT stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. So if you haven't heard that phrase before, it's the paperwork that somebody who's selling to the US government has to put together to say, this is how we tested our product for accessibility. This is what works. This is what doesn't work. It's required for all bids that come under Section 508, which is one of the government anti-discrimination procurement laws. So you can give it a summary of a bug, and it can tell you which WCAG criteria were violated. And then you can take that information and you can have it build the VPAT, the paperwork, because it's a template. It looks the same everywhere. It's just, 51 boxes that you have to either fill in, yep, I do this, or nope, I don't do this, and here are some of the ways that it's broken. So I've actually built a system where it will look at a bug database for a specific version of a product, and it will build out the entire VPAT from the bug database. Again, this is just all about grungy manual things that people don't want to do and how to make them more efficient. So an easy VPAT might take somebody like me 3 days to build. So 24, actual production hours. Somebody who's junior could take them 7 to 10 working days. With ChatGPT, you can do it in an hour and a half, maybe. You still have to go through and review everything manually, and you might not like the way some of the language was written, and so you have to tweak it a little bit. But looking at an hour and a half versus up to 80 hours of a junior person's time, that's kind of an easy trade-off to make. Okay, another thing that generative AIs are good at is intra and inter product comparisons. So one of the rules of accessibility is that your UIs are supposed to be consistent. So if you have an entire suite of products, for example, your menus are supposed to be ordered the same way. And that's because somebody who's blind will build a mental map of how they think those menus are built. And when they transition from one product to another product within the suite, you don't want to upset the apple cart by not having it work the same way. So you can actually give it 2 separate products within your company, or you can give it a product and a competitor's product, and you can do comparisons there and say, give me a list of features that my competitor does that I don't do. So that's something that generative AIs are good at. We built a generative AI app when I was at VMware that was a chat bot that would generate consistent error messaging. That's another area where it's absolutely required under WCAG that your error messaging has to be consistent. Well, we had developers from Bulgaria and China and Brazil, and so none of them were native English speakers, and the grammatical structure of the non-native languages was completely different. So instead, we had a chatbot ask 7 questions, and then it would generate an error message using the plain language guidelines that I discussed earlier, and it would feed it back to the developer, and it would say, hey, maybe use this. And the developer could either say, yep, that looks good to me, and they would just copy it and paste it into their code, or they'd say, yeah, I don't know about that. And they could go off and do their own thing. Dialog box organization is great. Dialog boxes are all supposed to be constructed the same way. So making sure that the OK button is always in the right place, that the cancel button is always using the same icon, things like that. ChatGPT can test for that quite easily, or generative AIs in general can test for that quite easily, where it would be a really horrible, intensive manual set of testing that would take a long time to finish, and then would have to be redone anytime the code got updated. So by being able to automate some of this stuff, not only are you going to be more efficient on the first run, but it's more likely to get rerun over and over and over as small changes are made, which means you're less likely to release something that's buggy, because you don't have to go through that entire manual process every single time you're making an update. Okay, so AI is not ready for prime time. I don't think there's anybody on this call that's going to argue with that. It always requires human review. Don't do, you just can't. I mean, there's so many lawyers, putting back on my legal hat here, that we just laugh at because they write briefs using ChatGPT and don't check them and send them straight into the court. And cases have been made up and facts have been modified, and just things that judges get very, very unhappy at. I always tell people not to focus on using generative AI to cut accessibility costs. That's not the point. The point is to take something that's not valuable, have it automated as a starting point, and then refocus the time and budget that you have on other more valuable things that you might not have done if you didn't have generative AI as a tool that you could use. Focus it on mundane stuff, and nobody's going to complain about not having to write an ACR VPAT ever again. That's like the grungiest thing in accessibility that everybody hates doing. And same thing for test plans. So those things it's very, very good at. And I kind of already talked about what you could do instead: voice recognition testing, switch testing, usability research. There's all kinds of things in the field of accessibility that get ignored because they're not part of WCAG. So that's where you can refocus your budget and your time that you're saving on these things, so that you can go above compliance and really make your product inclusive, instead of just coding to not get sued, which is more of a defensive posture. So kind of done. I didn't check the chat to see if any questions came in. Why doesn't ChatGPT have to comply with accessibility standards? They do. They just haven't been sued yet. The really annoying thing from my perspective, the one thing that seriously triggers me is companies that claim to be inclusive who aren't universally inclusive. Microsoft claims to be inclusive. Microsoft, is on the board of Disability In and drives a lot of the work that they do. But their subsidiaries and they're in the companies that they've invested in, like GitHub and OpenAI, not so much, because they're not universally enforcing the Microsoft accessibility standard on the subsidiaries. So that is irritating. And, somebody eventually will make an example of ChatGPT, because I can't imagine that the WCAG standards don't apply to them. Is it because they have nonprofit status? No.
Nonprofit status. Yeah, doesn't count. I'm sorry, Sheri. I just interrupted you. Please continue.
No. That's okay. That's kind of a question that's not obvious, and I was still talking. So there are museums that have been sued. There have been hospitals and universities who've been sued, for-profit, nonprofit. The only thing that status does is it makes it less likely that they're going to get sued, because they probably don't have deep pockets. So I'm talking about nonprofits in general. OpenAI is a nonprofit in name only. So that's definitely not the reason. Once
And
they
I'll
go
take
commercial,
I'll take Joe's question.
Sorry,
Who
go-
would sue ChatGPT for this? Probably NFB, I think. Maybe Sheri, you
yeah,
think so?
I would, NFB is definitely one of the more litigious of the nonprofits that focus on people with vision loss. There are 6 law firms in the United States that whose 100% of their business model is suing companies over accessibility. The only reason why OpenAI hasn't gotten sued yet is because they've got the deep pockets to actually defend that kind of suit. If a nonprofit gets government funding, they have to comply. Yes. So if you get money from the government, either directly or indirectly, the Section 508 strings requiring accessibility go with that money. So it doesn't matter what kind of nonprofit you are, doesn't matter if you get the money from the, feds, the state, the county, or, the Department of Arts for your city. If it originated anywhere with the feds at any point in time up the food chain, then yes, accessibility strings are required. The government is getting stricter about accessibility. The Title II regulations requiring compliance with WCAG 2.1 just came out in like April, Keith? April, okay. And so people have between like the next 15 to 24 months to comply with that. So that's all the schools, all the universities, and 96% of the websites today are inaccessible. So they've got their work cut out for them. CJ, is that question directed to Keith or me or both of us?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Keith,
Okay.
Keith, you go first while I read it.
What is a level 1 action a company should take to help strengthen the accessibility of a website with a generative program? Well, the irony, I think it's a great question, CJ. I think the answer to that is not specific to generative AI. It's specific to, what a company should do to get started with accessibility, right? So the first thing that they should do is evaluate where they are. That's usually through the process of an audit. If we're talking about a particular piece of software, if we're talking about a company and auditing and looking at the company as a whole, then you're looking at what's called a maturity assessment, which is similar to an audit, but looks at the 7 different ways in which accessibility is measured across a company. But that's the first thing that they would need to do. Next, after that, they need to after getting the results of their audits, then they need to put together a remediation plan to be able to resolve the issues that were identified. And then after doing that, or simultaneously while doing that, depending on the company, you're also putting a plan together to mature the organization so that you don't end up in the same situation. So the very first thing is identifying the problem. The next thing is, taking steps to deal with the problem. And the third is planning to not have the problem occur moving forward. Sheri, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's the easiest threshold question to ask yourself is what's the goal? So a lot of companies don't hear about accessibility until they can't bid on a particular government contract because they can't produce the ACR VPAT paperwork. So is your goal to produce an ACR VPAT for your, a particular version of your product, or is your goal to actually be inclusive and bulletproof your organization and make sure that not only are you fixing that problem that prevented you from bidding on that $5 million contract, and yes, I'm using that number for a reason because I knew a case where that happened. It's, am I making sure that I never produce software that can't be included in bids? Okay, well, that was a double negative. Am I producing software that can always be bid on contracts that come under Section 508? And as Keith said, that's when you need to get into a maturity assessment. If you have an accessibility team, you will be able to get your software accessible. Okay. If you do a maturity assessment and you fix everything that the maturity assessment identifies, you will be able to keep your software accessible. And I always try to convince people that keeping it accessible is more important than getting it accessible. But some people really only focus on the, I only have this much money and I need to be able to bid on this project. So I need to get this narrow thing done. Any accessibility is usually better than no accessibility, but everybody's ultimate goal should be to make the company want to to create an environment where producing accessible software is encouraged.
And that's a really great point, Sheri, that I think I missed in terms of thinking, what is the goal of the organization, right? Because each organization looks at accessibility very differently, right? Some of them look at it as the problem to be solved. Others look at it as an opportunity to grow. And those actions are going to be determined by those goals. Those are fantastic points.
Yeah, and some people do it proactively and some people do it reactively. So for some companies, they think it's perfectly fine to produce something that's completely inaccessible and then shop it out to India to have them fix it. Okay, that's definitely not going to produce the best product for your disabled customers.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna take the next question if that's okay, Keith, because it gets into some AI nerdiness. So would it be possible to create a GPT that's compliant, meaning GPTs created by private citizens? So there's 3 different areas that you can go wrong when you're creating AI. First is your data biased, right? If you go to DALL-E right now and ask it for a picture of a child with autism, you're going to get a really sad looking white boy in a classroom, because all of the data that's online right now is on autism, or at least I'd say it's vastly skewed towards white boys. You're not going to see women. You're not going to see people of color. And it's not because we're not autistic. We are. It's because the data is biased. So problem number 1 is the data. Problem number 2 is the algorithms, because the algorithms can be skewed. And then the third problem is the developers and the user interfaces. So there's a pretty famous case, that's been well discussed in the accessibility community, although the company who was responsible for this never owned up to it, where it was a self-driving car company, and they produced the first round of their software, said it was okay to hit a person in a wheelchair. And it was because the software identified the wheelchair as a shopping cart, because the developer programmed it to say wheelchairs don't go backwards. So when you leave people with disabilities out of the development cycle, these are the things that sometimes happen. And, let's look at machine learning, AI programming in general. In the US right now, it's about 90% white and Asian men. Okay. And typically they're not disabled. And if they are disabled, typically they're neurodivergent. There's a great series of surveys that Chat Overflow does every year. Stack Overflow, where it says 11% of people in IT identify as neurodivergent, but less than half of 1% identify as having significant levels of vision loss or significant levels of mobility loss. So you're going to lose out on that diversity if you don't make a significant effort to draw those people in. And then we get into this whole pipeline problem where, getting on one of my DEI capstone projects here, people with disabilities are discriminated against throughout the education process. They're less likely to graduate from high school, so they're less likely to go to college. They're less likely to graduate from college, so they're less likely to go to grad school. By the time you get down to the level of education that's required to be an AI or machine learning engineer, the chances of you having somebody in that pool who is a woman of color with a non-neurodivergent disability are vanishingly close to 0. And you have to recognize that for that, and you have to try to figure out what is it that I am going to do as a company while I'm building my GPT to prevent the bias that I know that exists from actually ending up in my LLM.
Right. But let's take the second part of that question also, like meaning GPTs made by private citizens, by myself, or someone else. It's not I think to the point, it's not only the question of who builds it, But primarily, and the thing why I work so hard to start with you from an experiential standpoint is to think about the perspectives of the people who are going to be using the tool, right? And be able to think about larger than yourself. It's as you know, kind of Sheri mentioned it. Well, not kind of Sheri, but Sheri mentioned, it's so important to have the involvement of different people on different wavelengths, different people, however they're different, represented in the pipeline. But that is just part of the process, to make sure that you're doing things right. The first person is thinking about it and just saying, okay, hey, how am I going to make sure, when I start off that I'm just thinking outside of myself. So that experience, of just literally for a moment closing your eyes, not using a mouse to navigate, trying something a little different, can put you in the frame to start to ask those critical questions that that Sheri is bringing out to help you understand what is actually being missed.
And to vet those questions against somebody with lived experience. I hear the question over and over and over and over, how do I build an unbiased AI? Okay, that's not the right question. The right question is, my AI is going to be biased. How do I detect it and how do I fix it?
Yeah.
I have a question around when you're comparing like one business to another, or one URL to another URL or whatever, and this isn't necessarily accessibility, but you mentioned like vision impaired people building mental patterns. And it's about consistent terminology. So like we know we have this problem often where, so you might have like people who are building a product say, okay, this product has a battery. And by the time it goes through all the stages and when the product is released, it becomes an energy pack and not a battery. So you have like that disambiguation with the terminology. Can you use ChatGPT or a large language model or whatever to recognize those inconsistencies in vocabulary if you don't have like a built-in controlled vocabulary?
So I'll give you an example of something that we did at VMware. We built a Microsoft plugin to look for particular terminology and to provide suggested alternatives. And we did that for DEI reasons. Okay, we wanted to get rid of phrases like rule of thumb and disabled when we were talking about buttons and things of that nature. So I don't even think you need a GPT is where I'm going with this. I think if you had somebody who built a custom Microsoft plugin that looked at the acceptable terms and the synonyms, and then could review a doc and say, hey, I think you need to look at these, 4 different places. Maybe you're not using quite the word that you want to use there.
Yeah, I'm talking like a Fortune 50 company level here. So I'm not sure if that would.
I think it would actually be easier to do a Microsoft plugin than it would be to do it on, certainly on a private LLM. Would be more time consuming. And on a public LLM, yeah, you can do it, but then you're putting your stuff out there for other people who are using the LLM to have access to, and then you've got all those, copyright issues that can come back and bite you in the behind. So, putting my risk assessment hat on as a former intellectual property attorney, I would say Microsoft plugins the right way to go for that.
Great, thank you.
So everybody learned today. What are the things you're taking away from this presentation today? What stuck with you? Go ahead and type it in the chat. Remember this whole active participation thing? And if you got nothing out of it today, that's important to know too. Let us know. Never skipped ally. Yep. Groovy. Yeah, I just assumed that companies would follow the law, says Claire. Lori, raise your hand. Lori, go ahead. On
Sorry, I
microphone.
had to unmute myself. So I had no idea what to expect of this conversation. CJ had told me about the group, and I'm the executive director of a disability organization. And so I'm not sure that I knew what I wanted from this. So I'm not sure that I'm walking away with, I'm not sure, first of all, I'm not sure I was the right audience because I do have enough knowledge to be dangerous, but we're not going to be developing certainly anything internally. And I was more looking at accessibility in the context of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their ability to utilize this technology in ways that might be helpful for them. So I just wanted to share that that's sort of where my head was, as opposed to what we produce, utilizing AI to make it even more accessible, which is all good to know and good to hear. And we've discussed plain language and the opportunities that might exist for example, government agencies that publish incomprehensible documents that really need to be looked at differently. But I do want to thank you all for allowing me to visit and listen in on this conversation, because I think there was a lot of really great information. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, awesome. And Lori, I think to your point in terms of learning how people with disabilities can leverage these technologies, I think that the short answer to that, in my mind, and I'm sure Sheri will have something to say in a second about it, is that you can leverage these technologies to do lots of different things for you. It's just asking the right questions and configuring it in a way that allows you to get the results that you're seeking. So always starting with your goal. For example, like I've created a number of GPTs just for myself. One of them, an accessibility GPT, which takes code that's been written rather complex and then makes it simple, the same way that Sheri gave an example of taking Herman Melville's and changing it into plain language. So you can definitely do all of those things. I think that if you have that goal, your first step is to really just go ahead and start experimenting. Look at what your audience is struggling to do and how they're struggling to do it, and then just start experimenting with Claude or with GPT or with Gemini and any of those, and see what kind of results that you can generate for yourself, if you can generate those in the ways that you want to. So it's just going to take a little bit of experimentation, but the short answer is yes, you can do it. And if we want to talk offline about other strategies to be able to do that, feel free to reach out to me. Any thoughts, Sheri?
Well, I just want to say one thing to Claire and Patsy about assuming that companies will follow the law. I've got two words for you. The first word is Uber, and the second word is Boeing. Okay, so most large companies operate, and 100% for startups as well, operate under the assumption that it's easier to ask for forgiveness and pay fines and pay out settlement agreements than it is to do it right in the first place.
That is so annoying. How can we change it?
Well, that's a bigger question than can be answered in an hour discussion on AI and accessibility.
Probably by making noise, right? But I came from this world. There used to be a lovely person by the name of Frances who was on the IBM side for accessibility, and she had weekly meetings, and it was there are things about IBM style that are drilled in as far as like word choice and things like that for content. So that was my training.
Yeah, and Frances is a great accessibility leader, and then she moved off doing her own thing, and it was Rui Zhao for a while, and I'm not sure who's doing it right now, but I feel like the effort at IBM might not be as strong as it used to be, and as the people from the generations with Francis start to retire, all that institutional knowledge
I'm glad you know
sometimes
her.
goes by the wayside.
Yeah, I'm glad you
Oh
know
yeah,
her.
no, Francis and I are definitely good friends.
Oh, so she was fabulous, and I agree with you. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that it was enforced. Like if you look at their rules for everything that was internal, right? But it's a thing. At least for supposedly for client products and supposedly for at least at government level products, because they have different levels of inclusion. But wouldn't you think you would want it like to include everyone all the time?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I just had one more comment too.
It's good.
Oh,
So
I'm sorry.
before we go to that, Lori says you need a champion. I'm going to spin that a different way. You need executive support, because you don't get a champion that has the teeth that people pay attention to without the executive support to go with it. At your organization, obviously your entire organization revolves around people with a particular type of disability, and so executive support isn't an issue. But at disability agnostic companies, executive support is definitely an issue. Champions without executive support just burn out.
That's true. So my comment was like, I work in PLAD, which is plain language and information design. And I was having a challenge with like, okay, what grade do I want ChatGPT to like describe this as? 3rd level, 4th level, a 10-year-old, a 9-year-old, whatever, because it doesn't understand numbers very well. But I found that I got really good answers when I asked it to explain as if English was my second language.
Mm-hmm. Or if you give it something objective to measure to, you could say, 8th grade level as measured by the Flesch-Kincaid reading scale. That just happens to be my favorite one. So that's the one I typically use, but it doesn't work for non-English languages. So you might have to use something different.
Mm-hmm.
So, 8th grade is usually my starting point, and then I will go up or down depending on who the audience is. When I was at McDonald's, we actually did 6th grade. When I was working in cloud security at VMware, we would go up to 14th, because pretty much everybody reading the documentation had a degree in computer science.
That's valid. Yep. I would love for you, Sheri, and Dr. Keith to leave your however you would like people to find you, your website, email address, link. We have your LinkedIn links in the LinkedIn post, but anything that you would like to leave here so people can find you after this event would be awesome.
So that's the QR code to find me on LinkedIn.
There you go. That's easy.
That's literally my only social media. I don't do Twitter. I have an assistant who copies what I do from LinkedIn over to Instagram and some other places, but those aren't my platforms. I don't engage there.
Perfect. But this is
inside the chat. So you've got my LinkedIn address there sitting inside the chat. So you can click on that and friend me, and we can continue this AI discussion all LinkedIn long.
Yeah. Well, I think we'd like to have you back at some point. So we do have some more sessions scheduled out. But if you would like to come back and talk to us, I think we'd love to have you back. So this has been a great presentation. Thank you so much. And I want to give anyone else a chance to ask questions if I've missed anyone.
Yeah, this was fun. I'm glad that we got a chance to do this.
And it'll be a little bit easier for me once I'm back on the West Coast again. As you can see, it's gotten very dark where I am. So, normally,
Joy, as my co-host, did you have anything to add?
Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much. This is very near and dear to my heart. I work in the healthcare industry, and I am constantly fighting for accessibility physically for my patients at work, and because there's always repairs that need to be done, and they can't get in the bathroom, and anyway, but I just wanted to thank you for coming in. Sorry I was late, but it was wonderful.
I was just hoping your car is safe this time.
I still haven't got that car back yet. It's awful.
And I worked at Kaiser Insurance for 3 years, Joy, helping them implement Obamacare. So I've got some pretty strong points of view, shocker, on accessibility in healthcare.
Well, this was just absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to educate us and guide us.
Thank you. My one request I'll make is that, if you found the thread on LinkedIn for this, if you happen to leave some comments, I think that would be groovy. Plus it'll enable me to get hair gel money.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think next month we have Morten Rand Hendrickson for our ethics guild presentation. And I can't remember what the title is because I forgot to look it up beforehand, but but the information will be out there. So love to see you back again next month and see everyone in the salon, on LinkedIn, wherever you may be. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Bye.